Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here at the Jerusalem Center, and seeing Dan on the wall reminds me of how often I was here and how many meetings we had in those days, and Dan's presence certainly has been central in my own life. Now, it's really an appropriate moment, I think, to revisit the subject of American Jewish journalism. I didn't know anybody owned that book by Luke Ford. After I gave him permission to reprint that article, I got into trouble. And the reason I got into trouble, it turns out Luke Ford is a well-known pornographer. I didn't know that. I guess I don't read the right books, and people were appalled that I allowed my article on journalism to be there, but there are no pictures in the book, so it can be read. Anyway, when I did last look at the subject, and although he republished it in 2004, the piece was originally written early in the 1990s, I focused on the independence and the quality of Jewish journalism. And if we think back at that moment, a new nationwide Jewish newspaper had appeared, the English language Forward, which became an independent weekly in English in 1990. The Jewish Week at that time, which wanted to compete with the Forward and upgrade Jewish journalism, brought Gary Rosenblatt back from Baltimore. He'd been associated years earlier with the paper. He becomes the editor in 1993. There was a sense at that time that Jewish journalism was really on an upswing, not just in terms of a new, younger generation, but also in terms of the quality. And I wrote at that time, throughout American Jewish journalism, one sees evidence of burgeoning professional pride and a striving for excellence. And I continued, the Jewish press as a whole is stronger today than it has been in many decades. And I think that was true at that time, especially in larger cities. And it's a reminder that history is not necessarily prophecy, but nobody, I think, sitting and looking at Jewish journalism in 1990 could have predicted how things would develop over the next 20 years. I'm going to talk about those changes, some of which I think are well known to people sitting here, but since I'm a historian, let me give some background first, and then we'll turn to some of the changes. Scholars often date Jewish journalism, its origins, all the way back to 17th century Amsterdam, and then there's a reason for that, but the truth of the matter is that Jewish journalism as we know it really emerges in the 1840s, and that's true in the United States, in England, in France, in Germany, and elsewhere as well. If you read Jewish scholars, they naturally give Jewish reasons for the emergence of journalism. The best-known book relates it to the Damascus affair and the need for Jews around the world to respond and work together to defend Jewish rights, in that case, the rights of Jews who had been imprisoned, falsely charged with murdering a priest in Damascus. And of course, Moses Montefiore goes out to Damascus. There was a sense of world Jewry coming together, and journalism certainly helped to create that sense of world Jewry. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of newspapers, non-Jewish ones, also emerged at that time. And I think the emergence of the Jewish press, and this is significant for our era, is no less a response to technological change. Drastically cut the price of printing and of paper. And the truth, and both of those together really allowed for mass journalism to develop, because if printing was cheaper and then you developed much cheaper paper, you could have very cheap newspapers. This is the era when we see the family newspaper, the so-called penny press, the semi-pornographic flash press, the so-called mail weeklies. They all emerge at the same time in response to this revolution, technological revolution, that created many, many new possibilities. And if you read the early newspapers, you can see the earliest newspapers tended to focus on business and the political elite. But now, after the 1840s, mass journalism emerges. In the United States, which is where I work, we can date Jewish journalism quite specifically to April of 1943 with the emergence of the Occident. The Occident is still one of the best Jewish periodicals the Jewish community ever produced. A certain number of issues, if you want to check it out, are on the web these days. I think it's www.theoccident.org, and I hope within a year the whole of the Occident, as well as many other publications of Isaac Leeser, will have a separate website really highlighting his role. We talked a minute ago about Philadelphia, and of course Isaac Leeser was the leading, he was the Chazan of Mikveh Israel, one of the most significant traditionalist religious leaders of the day. And Isaac Leeser, and one has to give him enormous credit, because no religious leader really recognized it before, he understood the power of the press. He must have published 100 different titles and used his journal and his printing press in general as a vehicle for strengthening Jewish life. And this was especially important in the United States, where Jews, the Central European Jews, were far flung. They're going off out to the frontier, and he understood that the printing press, newspapers, books, and so on, could really bring them together. In other words, he created a print community, really the antecedent of what we would call the virtual community. But both understood that you now had ways of bringing people together who were geographically dispersed. And his Occident informed Jews, defended Jews, linked them to one another. Now, it was, as I say, a quality of publication, a great historical source, but there were limits, which are rather interesting, to what Isaac Leeser would print. Quote, "On no account can our pages become the vehicle for violent denunciation or unfounded aspersion," he writes in the introduction. And then he, I think rather naively, for those who are involved in journalism, he naively urged readers, quote, "never to send us anything which may require contradiction or amendment in future numbers." It didn't quite work out that way. The idea was, I think, to project an image of consensus, of Jewish consensus. Really, this is the newspaper as a projection of the community as you want it to be, rather than the community as it was. I think that he anticipated a problem that long plagued the field. We'll talk about new problems, but one of the longest problems in the field is a tension between the Jewish journalist as a reporter of news and the Jewish journalist as a shaper of community. In other words, is your highest goal to say what's going on, or is your highest goal to have certain ideals which you want to promote, which may mean you want to hide some of the things that are going on? Am I more a publicist for the community, or am I more a mirror of the community, maybe even trying to show the community some of its problems? Lisa, I would say, was very worried about controversy. So, for example, if you were working, as I think many will be in the next few years, we're coming up to the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. If you were working on American Jewry and the Civil War, and you read the Occident, you would come to the conclusion that most Jews paid no attention to the major concerns of the day over slavery, over union versus disunion, and so on, because it's barely reflected in the Occident. However, that's not because Jews weren't concerned about them. Everybody was concerned about it. It's simply he banned those kinds of debates from the paper because he considered them harmful to the Jewish community. The truth is, he also sympathized with the South more than the North, and Philadelphians, as a rule, sympathized with the North. It would probably have been bad for his business to talk too much about the Civil War, and on the occasion when he did, after Grant expelled the Jews in 1862, what he wrote was pretty horrific in my view. He was very prejudiced, and none of his biographers have had the courage to write about unfortunate, it was a great blind spot, his prejudice against the African Americans. But the truth is that, and slavery proves it, self-censorship in a newspaper comes at a deep price. Jews who sought to debate hotly contested issues had no Jewish forum in which to do so. Now, once the Occident proved successful, it naturally generated a lot of other journals on the American scene for the Jewish community, published in diverse locations: New York, New Orleans, Cincinnati, San Francisco. And pretty soon we see that developments in the U.S. differ from most other countries in terms of journalism. When you look at London, England, or France, or Germany, there were nationwide Jewish newspapers. Yes, the London Jewish Chronicle, and that helped to bring the whole Jewish community of the country together. That's what Isaac Leeser thought would happen too, but it didn't happen. Instead, we really moved away from all embracing national papers and towards local or regional papers, much narrower in focus and circumscribed. That's what happens in American journalism generally, until the last couple of decades, when the New York Times and USA Today and the Wall Street Journal became national papers. American journalism was deeply local, and that's what happens to Jewish journalism as well. Most of the Jewish journals become weeklies, not monthlies like the Occident, and they tended to model themselves after American religious and family newspapers, not after highbrow magazines. So they're different from the Occident. They look more like inexpensive dailies, and they start to be entertaining. The greatest of those newspapers was Isaac Mayer Wise's Israelite, later the American Israelite, published in Cincinnati. And, he publishes on the front page chapters from a novel every single week. They're not great novels, but his sense was you had to entertain. And he didn't have any of Isaac Leeser's fears about being provocative and polemical, and people read them in part to find out what is Isaac Mayer Wise railing about this week, and so forth. But he also published lots of scoops. He had all sorts of people who fed him information, and from all over the country, and he often would publish it, based on anonymous tips. Today it still exists, the American Israelites, the oldest continuously appearing American Jewish newspaper, and unlike the Occident, its major goal was to promote a particular ideology, Reform Judaism, and it was unafraid of controversy in defense of that ideology. As I said, he It was lively, had a rather biting style, much more entertaining. It gets a national audience, the Israelite, indeed. I think it was on its 20th anniversary, they changed the name from the Israelite to the American Israelite. But that doesn't make it a national newspaper, and indeed today it's a rather narrow weekly, and no longer a semi-official organ representing the reform movement. It really deteriorated, which is worth remembering. We tend to imagine, oh, you start low and everything gets better and better. A case could be made that in the 20th century, American Jewish journalism was the very opposite. It started very strong with Wise and Lisa, and it deteriorated in the first half of the 20th century. It's certainly true of the Israelite. I can't imagine anybody in this room reads it, but once upon a time, I read it too. It was a must-read newspaper. You only read it today to find out which of your friends is still alive in Cincinnati. But what is important about the Israelite is it starts a tradition of movement-sponsored periodicals, and in the best cases, the idealism, the energy, the commitment that stood behind the movement is reflected in the journal. So, for example, the American Hebrew, vibrant newspaper created in 1879 by religiously traditional young Jews, their ages were 21 to 29, hoping to revitalize American Jewish life. And it becomes an enormously significant Jewish newspaper. Again, parentheses. I'm hoping, it hasn't happened yet, but I'm hoping that there is a project to bring a bunch of these newspapers online, and that'll revolutionize really our ability to look at them, to learn American Jewish history, to get those. You have students to write from primary sources. So if it happens within the next year or so, the American Hebrew will be one of them that will be online. And later on, we have journals like the Menorah Journal, that was movement-based. The Reconstructionist, the same idea. Those followers of Mordechai Kaplan. Jewish Frontier, a student newspaper, if we move all the way into the 1970s. Genesis 2. These were all journals that were sponsored by groups that had particular aims, and you can see the energy behind them, and that's why people read them. Going back to Isaac Mayer Wise, I don't know how he did it. He also was a major rabbi of a huge congregation. He actually produced 2 newspapers a week. One in, and they weren't the same. One in English, the American Israelite, and one in German, Die Deborah. It's more geared to women. You can see its name was Die Deborah. It's a very long tradition, it reflects a very long tradition of foreign language Jewish newspapers in America. We also had Jewish newspapers in foreign languages. They've appeared in German, in Hebrew, in Yiddish, in Ladino, now in Russian, and very often they mediated between the new country and the old world that immigrants came from. It wrote for them in their language, but it taught them about the world they were now a part of. The most famous and important, of course, was the Forward, which did so much to mediate between 2 worlds for East European Jewish immigrants. Now, when we move into the 20th century, the Anglo-Jewish press increases in circulation, but declines in quality. Rabbi Stephen Wise, no relation to Isaac Mayer, Stephen Wise always used to call them the weeklies, which he spelled W-E-A-K-L-I-E-S. He thought they were called weekly because they're weak. And there are really 3 reasons for the decline, at least. First of all, with the proliferation of local Jewish newspapers, we almost inevitably see a move away from national issues that were so important to the Occident towards narrower, local-oriented journalism with a very strong component of boosterism. I want to promote my community. And also, local Jewish newspapers outside of major population centers especially couldn't attract the kinds of contributors a national newspaper could, and they became more modest and consensus-oriented. If you read them, they sought to convey information, promote local community involvement, communal involvement, defend Jews against their enemies, but a lot of those papers would have moments when they'd be very important. Just like those of you who come from Houston remember that after the New Orleans hurricane, a paper that wasn't a must-read paper suddenly spent night and day. I met the editor and produced some of the best coverage of Jewish aspects of New Orleans, because many of the refugees came to Houston. New Orleans paper was knocked out, and it had its moment. That's true of many of these local papers. Only, as I say, a few have larger aims. In Boston, the Jewish Advocate, when it was founded as a paper to promote Zionism. Jacob DeHaas was really sent by Theodore Herzl to America, and in its early years, the Jewish Advocate is a very great newspaper, again motivated by these larger aims, and wasn't afflicted by the parochialism of so many newspapers. That's another paper that declined steadily over the course of its career. Now, so that's one point, the localism. Second of all, there were financial pressures. And we're going to come back to that theme when we look at what happens today. But a lot of these papers couldn't break even in the 20th century, especially the smaller ones. And like it or not, they came under the auspices of financial backers. Beginning in the 1940s, in cities like Philadelphia, the Jewish Federation stepped in to cover the annual deficit of the Jewish newspaper, and that meant that the Jewish newspaper became dependent rather than independent, and that, of course, had a huge impact, as they say in Hebrew, Baal HaMe'ah, Baal HaDayah. That means he who pays the piper picks the tune. And there was a study of this in Philadelphia, and not surprisingly, when the Federation owns the newspaper, you don't find a lot of criticism of the Federation in the newspaper. And even widely available negative news doesn't make it into the paper, or only after it's widely available elsewhere in the Jewish newspaper is embarrassed. In smaller communities, even independent editors found that they couldn't alienate subscribers or advertisers, so they played it safe. And this continues within the last few years, since we read the American Israelite, which is an independent paper. There was a new Jewish community center being built in Cincinnati. The editor of the paper was critical of certain aspects of the new Jewish community center. The JCC was an important advertiser. They said either she goes or our ads go, and I leave to your imagination which of the two people, which of the two is no longer in the newspaper. That was a lesson about small newspapers. Most of those editors, I know many of them, justified their compromises as necessary to keep the local Jewish newspaper alive. Unless we make these compromises, the newspaper will simply die out and fade away. Privately, they'll tell you all sorts of stories, but better a bad newspaper than none at all. The third issue that affected Jewish journalism in the 20th century was actually anti-Semitism, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, because between the wars, had a chilling effect on the ability of Jewish newspapers to report the news accurately. Fear stalked the Jewish community, conditions for Jews deteriorated, and newspapers became frightened of controversy, of scandal, on any news that reflected badly on the Jewish people, because they opened themselves to charges that you are giving aid and comfort to our enemies. So they worked hard to promote an image of consensus, of sobriety, not wishing to do anything that might cast the Jewish people in a bad light. And that tradition is a very long one. Frequently, if you want to follow a court case involving Jews or some scandal, you've actually got to look at the general press rather than at the Jewish press. When I lived in Cincinnati, there was a very sad case of a student at the Hebrew Union College who was charged, later acquitted, of misdeeds against young children. Those are always salacious cases. It was front page and television news for weeks in the city, but you won't find hardly a word about it in the Jewish newspaper. They thought if we don't cover it, nobody will notice it. But of course that was ridiculous, and but told you something about a state of mind. In Philadelphia in the 19th century, a famous case of Walter Cresson. He converted to Judaism, and his family sued him for being crazy, and it was a very important court case, but you'll find nothing about it practically in the Jewish newspaper at the time. He was actually, it's very important that he was found innocent, even though if you read the back, if you read the letters, he was found, if you read the private letters, most of the Jews knew. Walter Cresson, some here in Israel, in Palestine, changed his name. Michael Boaz, Israel, became a Sephardic Jew. He's you'll get me going on Cresson, I'll never finish the lecture. Cresson was from a Quaker family, the brother of Eliot Cresson, the famous anti-slavery. They all sued him. He probably was a little bit nutty, but no Jew wanted a court to say that conversion to Judaism was ipso facto proof of insanity. So leading Jews, it was one of the last public appearances of Mordecai Noah, the first great Jewish leader, all lined up behind Cresson, even though privately they sometimes knew otherwise. In any case, the press exercises a great deal of self-censorship. I think with the best of intentions, it believes that is in the interests of the Jewish people, but of course, the result is a loss of credibility, because Jews seeking accurate and reliable news turned elsewhere. Now, some of them turned to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, founded in 1917. Very important. We don't have a good history. There is an article in the Leo Becker book recently, don't have a good history of JPA. It was really designed to do what the local newspapers couldn't do, and that is cover the world. It's founded in World War I to provide news from the war from a Jewish point of view. Most Jews in America had relatives caught in the war, and it then becomes the dominant provider of worldwide Jewish news for almost all of the Jewish weeklies. For a very long time, that was very important. The Jewish community often reflected a certain consensus because everybody was getting the same news from the JPA. That, again, is what has changed in our day with the Internet. I do think it had quality. The secret, someone here looking for a doctoral dissertation, there's a great doctorate, difficult to write, but very important to be written on the role of the JPA during World War II, when they set up secret organizations to collect news of what was going on. The story's never been revealed, but it should be at this point. And it later played a very important role on reporting Jewish news from behind the Iron Curtain. It surpasses almost any other source in terms of what kinds of news it was able to acquire. But it also created a certain uniformity of perspective. And the JTA, I would say, faced some of the same tensions the weeklies faced. On the one hand, it's committed to journalistic detachment. On the other hand, it has a total attachment to the American Jewish community to which it is beholden. And in the news business, that's always a tension. Even major newspapers suffer that tension. Somebody pays the bills, always. But I think that the Jewish ones feel it particularly. The other source that becomes central for Jews is the New York Times, of course. It's purchased in 1896 by Adolph Oakes, the son-in-law of Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. This was a family interested in journalism when Wise's daughter married Adolph Oakes, who then ran a small newspaper in Tennessee. Everybody in Cincinnati thought that she had married way below her stature. But after he became significant in the New York Times, they all thought better of this particular marriage. And the Times, even before Oakes' day, paid a lot of attention to news of Jewish interest because it had such a huge Jewish population and readership. But after Oakes, that really grows, and Jews to this day, rightly or wrongly, perceive the Times as the ultimate authority on substantial news of Jewish interest. If it gets into the Times, it's real Jewish news. Otherwise, it's not. And the Times has projected always a certain air of objectivity and detachment that Jewish newspapers have had trouble matching. So, as I said, the American Jewish press improved in the last decades of the 20th century. A lot of the reason for the improvement of Forward and the Jewish Week had to do with the aftermath of the Watergate scandal. Watergate really improved the whole image of journalism. They were the good guys. They knew the truth. They found it. There were novels and movies about journalists. And we saw a young generation of journalists bringing ideas from crusading new journalism into mainstream journalism. And a more confident American Jewish community was more willing to accept critical journalism. There were criticisms, when the Forward printed the salaries of some of the leading Jewish communal figures in the United States, all of which are available on tax records. There was, as you can imagine, a Schrei of Gewalt, and how yellow this journalism is, and on and on. But the truth of the matter is that the Forward had the great advantage of being supported by a foundation, and of course, it became a national and respected newspaper. Any number of reporters in the Forward later moved on to the New York Times and other significant newspapers, which had not much happened earlier, because of those kinds of stories, and the community changed and became more willing, especially younger members, to accept that kind of journalism. And happily, a lot of newspapers did very well. Jews were more affluent. That meant stores were willing to buy ads, thinking, oh, this is the way to reach an affluent population. And newspapers that knew how to market themselves, like the Baltimore Jewish Times, which, in its heyday could have 80, 100 pages a week, they really did very well. The newspapers became wealthy. The quality rose. You could hire better journalists. You could be more independent. There was a real sense of a new era emerging in Jewish journalism. But just as we were becoming smug, technology, the same force which had created that Jewish journalism, that's why it began with the revolution in the printing press, it conspired to undermine all journalism, especially Jewish journalism as we know it. The development and rapid spread of the World Wide Web really undermine the fundamentals of journalism, even, and this is the irony of contemporary journalism, even as it created undreamt of opportunities for new kinds of journalism. And what happened? Well, first of all, very quickly, historical times, with the rise of the internet, newspaper readership begins to fall. Young people, a very important demographic, increasingly get their news from the web. Circulation figures drop from year to year, and the average age of the reader, especially of the Jewish newspaper reader, but it's actually true of all American newspapers, the average age of readers rises year by year. Gary Rosenblatt is fond of saying the average age of the readership of the Jewish Week is dead. Now, as readership falls, that is, circulation falls, and the average age of readers rises, advertising falls. And that was enormously serious for the Jewish press. And certain kinds of advertising, which had just been the meat and potatoes, classified ads. You knew you'd have classified ads even in bad times. People want to sell stuff, sometimes more than in good times. And classified ads and shadchanas ads that had become quite popular, they all disappear. Why should I pay the Jewish newspaper when I can put it on the internet, on eBay for free, or Craigslist? So eBay and Craigslist, which are wonderful from the seller's point of view, decimate newspapers and Jewish newspapers. Why should I advertise in the singles page of the Jewish newspaper when I can go on J-Day? And then larger scale advertisers, not the little ones that added up, but the large scale advertisers shifted dollars away from newspapers to the web. It's not that the big advertisers said, oh, there's a web out there, let's double our advertising budget. Instead, understandably, they said, well, we want to shift some dollars away from this advertising medium to that advertising medium. And so when you put those together, circulation is down, advertising is down, naturally revenue plummets. Now, lots of newspapers, and the best of the Jewish newspapers, develop websites, which, by the way, is a cost. But websites have proved very hard to monetize. I was surprised. I had assumed that the Jerusalem Post, which has more ads than any of the Jewish newspapers, would make money. But I understand that it really doesn't. That nobody has found a way to monetize in a serious way the web. The famous statement, information wants to be free. That's what computer hackers declared. And so, if you are in the newspaper business, they now refer to that as the original sin of web-based journalism. The original sin was that you didn't charge for it. And almost everything becomes available free of charge. And really no newspaper website, to my knowledge, contributes to its bottom line. You have two traditions. Most of the important Jewish newspapers, the Forward, the Jewish Week, and so on, they all have free websites. The Jewish Week claims that actually its website has led to a certain number of new subscribers, and that has made it possible. There are a couple of newspapers. The Boston Jewish Advocate does not have a paid website, but almost nobody goes to it for that reason. The Israeli papers have seen great success with their websites, which are free, and if something happens in the Middle East, the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz and even Arutz Sheva all find that their websites are very heavily read by people around the world. Now, so now we've added an additional cost, but no real revenue from it. And then, of course, what they like to call now the Great Recession further battered Jewish newspapers. Newspapers that had subsidies found that their subsidies were cut. We're cutting everything, we got to cut you. And the Jewish community is at least 20% poorer than it was 2 years ago, and Jewish federations are down, and so Jewish newspapers have suffered. And in bad times, revenue from advertising and circulation further declines. Advertising revenue across journalism declined over the past 2 years, and a certain number of people say, I'm cutting back. What I'm going to cut back on are these newspapers, especially since I can, after all, read them for free. As a result, some newspapers shifted to the web. Everybody's watching the Milwaukee newspaper, which is now, except a few times a year, a web-based paper. Other newspapers went out of business entirely. More and more newspapers dropped the JTA, and the JTA is very interesting as an illustration of what I'm saying. It has actually more readers than ever before, but far fewer sponsors from papers. They used to be the major sponsor of the JTA. They no longer are. And some Jewish newspapers decided that the secret of staying alive was to focus exclusively on local news, since local newspapers, yes, the Newton Tab and a whole series of newspapers none of you have ever heard of, but the equivalent of Kol Ha'ir or the local newspapers in Israel, those newspapers actually did well because, or better, because of the nature of advertising. You could really target, and the Jewish newspapers said, we'll go local as well. We'll focus on people who are really known, and the quality, professors of journalism may think the quality of the newspaper declines, but our readers will be glad to see their neighbors and friends in the paper, and that's how we'll stay alive. Very, very tiny staff, usually very underpaid. Say the Jewish Advocate takes people right out of J school, or sometimes people who are eager to become journalists, and gives them, as they say, a great opportunity to get a lot of writing done, a lot of clips in the newspaper. In other words, we work you very hard, we pay you almost nothing, and as soon as you get a better job, you'll move on, so nobody really learns who's in town. And in smaller communities, one sees that a lot. But on the positive side, Jewish journalists have never enjoyed so many readers as they have now. A story can go viral, meaning that it can reach millions of people. And unquestionably, all journalists find this. It used to be, if you were out in the boondocks, only your readers read you. Today, if you're lucky, someone picks it up and it goes all over. Second, the average American Jew, or the average Jew anywhere, has unprecedented diversity of journalism available. I don't just have to read the one in my community. I can go online and I can read everything. I can read journals about different cities. If I'm interested in Israel, I can read whatever journal agrees with my politics. Indeed, one of the reasons, in my view, that the American Jewish community is today a mirror of Israel, meaning all the same divisions from left to right as Israel had, is they're getting their news from Israel now and being influenced. You want to read criticisms of Israel, read Amira Hess and J Street, and they sound very similar. You want the other side, read Arut Sheva, and so on. Are you Orthodox? Read Vosis Nayas, or the Yeshiva World. If you're anti-Orthodox, read Failed Messiah, and so on and so forth. We never had this array of diverse options available to anybody with a computer. And there are very exciting developments in web-based journalism. And the advantage of web-based journalism is that upwards of 50% of the cost of any newspaper is simply printing and distribution. If you do it on the web, you don't have those costs. So the basic cost is much cheaper. The JCPA was actually one of the pioneers here, and its daily alert is very broadly read on Israel and the Middle East. It is an aggregator, meaning it brings together news from different sources, makes it available. That's become more and more common. The JTA was once very little known outside of Jewish professionals. It was rather expensive. You got the JTA by subscription and so on. And now, of course, the JTA has a daily a briefing, almost a must-read for anyone who cares about the Jewish world, and it's free. The JTA doesn't make much money from it. In my view, it plays a very, very important niche, and it's very unfortunate. We try to get more for our money from JTA, which has a budget of about $1.2 million, than from any other Jewish organization in the United States, but it scrapes with that money. It gives us a lot of news elsewhere. Probably the most exciting new development in Jewish journalism is Tablet, very handsomely subsidized. And note well, there are new developments that are subsidized and new developments that are not. Tablet is subsidized by Karen Keshet. It very wisely invested in state-of-the-art graphics and in the finest of young Jewish journalists and writers. And he's publishing some of the best features, most widely read cultural articles, and because it's independent and has a commitment of several years, it can venture into controversy as well, and really overnight became very widely read in Jewish circles. Very recently, within the last few months, a new daily appeared entitled Jewish Ideas Daily, this one subsidized by Roger Hertog, and others, and there's supposed to be other online publications in the works. As I say, the most successful innovations in Jewish journalism in recent years are one and all heavily subsidized, usually by individuals or organizations with an agenda, with a point of view, with a desire to see some niche filled in the market. By contrast, independent Jewish journalism, meaning independent Jewish newspapers, JTA, online independents, they all live hand to mouth. I don't think there's a single American Jewish newspaper at this point that is truly turning profit. There's, of course, a lot of bitterness on the part of independents concerning subsidized publications. There are questions concerning journalistic independence, when a funder can threaten to pull the plug if an article he or she dislikes is published. There is a discussion, we're seeing it in the general field of journalism and in the Jewish field, that what we need is a large non-profit corporation with public and private funding to promote the free flow of ideas and information. That was the idea behind the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and some have argued that that is the only way to save journalism as we know it. However, others argue that the web is a free marketplace of ideas and information, and they argue that the invisible hand always works its magic. If there are subsidies, the subsidies cancel each other out. And besides, news aggregators make it possible for the discerning reader to garner a wide range of news stories and features representing a full spectrum of views and opinions. Now, I think in the United States today, there is a very strong sense that there are too many Jewish news organizations and websites, and behind the scenes, there's a great deal of talk about mergers to cut costs. Just imagine the average person trying to keep abreast. Some of you are these people. You're reading JTA, you're reading Tablet, you're reading the Jewish Week, you're reading the Forward, maybe you're reading several local Jewish newspapers. For such people, the benefits of merger sound enticing, but at the same time, it's worth remembering that the loss of any significant Jewish voice diminishes us as a community. We benefit from the diversity of journalistic voices in Jewish life, just as we benefit, I think, from the diversity of synagogues and the proliferation of different books. If some of these voices disappear, I think we'll be a poorer community. As you hear, I should give full disclosure, I'm on the board of JTA, but I'm especially worried about the implications of the JTA disappearing. I think the community would only appreciate what it does if we didn't have it anymore. What's going on today is that American Jewish journalism is a mile wide and an inch thick. There are many, many news outlets, but very little money to cover investigative journalism, to send reporters into the field. There are fewer and fewer reporters of Jewish news in the U.S. who can be sent to Israel because there isn't money to do it. There's less and less money to educate Jews about Judaism and Jewish life in newspapers, and many of the Jewish newspapers are no longer essentially covering Jewish news abroad. Just go and look at the London Jewish Chronicle and compare it to any American Jewish newspaper and see how much news of the Jewish world is completely unknown even to Jews who carefully read the American Jewish press. In America today, there are only two countries that are covered. You cover American Jewry and you cover Israel. Everything else is a vast desert. Pretty well, and it's very different in Europe, and American Jews don't know about it. American Jewish journalism is becoming increasingly localized, increasingly parochial, at the very time when the American Jewish community is more worried than it has been before about strengthening Jewish peoplehood. Jewish peoplehood suggests a very broad sense of Klal Yisrael, and who better than a Jewish newspaper to promote that, but instead Jewish newspapers are more and more local. I think journalism has a huge role to play in educating Jews, strengthening the ties that link Jews to one another and across the world, and very few Jewish news outlets fulfill those roles well. And now, in thinking about how to close, you stole my thunder here, because I look back at those questions that I had written, and I said, those questions are not such bad questions. It seems to me, as we look forward to the transformation, we are living amidst one of the great transformations in history, just as print created a great transformation, so we are living in a technological revolution that will be looked back upon as no less significant than the development of printing, and it is bringing about a historic transformation of all journalism in the world. And so we do need to return to first principles and ask key questions. And so, even though you heard them once, I slightly changed them. And besides, it's near Pesach, so we're thinking about 4 questions. So it seems to me that there are 4 questions that the community particularly needs to address. And the first is, what is the mission of Jewish journalism? Is its mission to inform, to educate, to defend, to support one or another ideology, to promote community and continuity? And if you cop out and say, well, it has all of those missions, what happens when 2 of them come into conflict? Which is higher in the hierarchy? Do we want to have Jewish newspapers that are looking closely and investigating Jewish organizations? Is that important? And so on. Second, what are the responsibilities of Jewish journalism? Should the good of the Jewish people or the good of the local Jewish community be the highest goal, or should truth be the highest goal? What happens when the two come into conflict? And that's not an easy question. Some of you will remember some years ago in one of the most famous pieces of investigative journalism in the United States in the Jewish community, one of the very few that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, were a series of articles that showed huge problems in the Jewish National Fund. They were not transparent. A lot of money was going in directions that certainly the donors didn't know, and so on and so forth. Contributions to the Jewish National Fund plummeted and have never recovered. And indeed, it's a good subject to discuss. Some people in the JNF argued, you basically killed the goose that laid the golden eggs. Why was it necessary to publish that information? Surely we are worse off for having no JNF or a poor JNF than we were before. The other side says, that's what journalism is for, to investigate. You wanted to cover up those deeds, and you're blaming the newspaper for your own misdeeds that we discovered. But that's a great example of the two coming into conflict, the good of the Jewish people versus truth. Third, what are the responsibilities, and this was not in the original, in the one you read, what are the responsibilities of the Jewish community, as a community, towards Jewish journalists and the Jewish press? Should the community subsidize the press? Should it control the press? Should it, on the other hand, encourage as many journalistic voices as possible to be heard in an era of scarce resources? Should a Jewish newspaper, print or online, be a community priority? Or perhaps the organized Jewish community has no responsibilities at all toward the press. Maybe if individuals want Jewish news, we should organize for it and pay for it ourselves. I throw out those questions, but those are the questions that I think are most central on the agenda of the Jewish community as we move forward and see that Jewish newspapers are not making a profit. Nobody has found a way to turn them into going concerns at the moment. Finally, and then I'll finish, what compromises should a Jewish newspaper or an online journal be prepared to make in order to ensure its survival? Should it seek private or communal support? How much independence should it be prepared to sacrifice in return for such support? What red lines must it refuse to cross? What happens if a Jewish community has no Jewish print or online newspaper? What are the consequences of Jewish media outlets going out of business? It will be a very important subject to examine. We'll only know what we get from a Jewish newspaper when we look at communities that don't have them. In any case, they're not easy questions. I'm not sure that history provides us with sure answers based on past experience, but I do think that these are the questions that we will be wrestling with over the next decade, and I look forward to any comments and questions that you have.
Just keep the figures up. Okay, I'll read what I have so far and then the ones which I
Maybe we should take a few questions together.
Yeah, we take together. Okay, sorry. Look, I'll read out what I have, and I haven't seen all of them. I have Dr. Sarah Schmidt, I have Izzy Liebler, I have Bill Millman, Sidel Kaplan, I have Judge Bach, I have Edward Cohen, and Rabbi Edward Rettig. Sorry, did you? Okay, is that it? What's your name?
Eileen Rosenblum.
Okay, I can take one more.
Okay.
What's your name?
Zaki Shalom.
goes the list, and we take them 3 by 3. Okay, first Dr. Sarah Schmidt, then easy leader. Sarah?
As a fellow academic, my first question would be to ask you how you define Jewish journalism. You're talking about it. Do you mean journalism only geared to Jews who are reading it? Do you mean journalism only published for Jews? I mean, there's a broader implication. And where in that spectrum, and what is the relationship that you would make via American Jewish journalism and Israeli journalism? That is to say, to what degree do you think the New York Jewish Week or the Boston Jewish Advocate or whatever ought to be getting involved with coverage of Israeli news when you can find Israeli news sources? And sort of a sub-question of that is, I'm one of these people who reads many of the items that you mentioned. An editor like Gary Rosenblatt of the New York Jewish Week often has editorials in which he, quote, tells Israel what to do. And as an Israeli, I've been living in Israel for 30 years, as an Israeli, I resent Gary Rosenblatt coming here for 2 weeks or for a conference and then telling Israel what to do. I may resent Haaretz telling Israel what to do too, but at least they have a right to do so. They're here and bear the responsibilities. And to what degree you think American Jews could, should, might get involved with Israeli politics, or is that crossing a kind of red line? And third, I want to say that the journal, if you will, that I most enjoy reading that's Jewish related is Tablet, because I don't think Tablet is judgmental, at least not so far. It seems to come closest to the degree that anybody can in quote telling the truth or reporting it.
Easy, and then Bill.
Thank you. I think that was a fascinating address you gave us, and it does not cover American Jewry. It really covers the entire Jewish world, because this issue of Jewish journalism, to my mind, is one of the most central issues. Has always been important, but somehow or other today, in the context of the environment in which we're living today, where greater and greater hostility towards us in different areas, particularly in relation to Israel, is emerging throughout the entire world, even increasingly in the United States, especially the last week or so, as we've seen, with an explosion here and there. The role of Jewish journalism becomes infinitely more important than it's ever been. And unfortunately, it is both a source and a power for doing great things and a power for doing very bad things. A power for doing bad things, and this does not apply to the United States, probably applies to us here, is when there are distortions. And who's going to be the determining person who's going to say what is a distortion? Of course, there are value judgments involved. But if there are total distortions of Israeli life being promoted by Israeli news media, which go outside, that, to my mind, has been one of the greatest factors, much greater than the blunders of our government, in the destruction of the Israeli image. Because if an Israeli media says things which are outlandish or outrageous, kal v'chomer, you can't tell a non-Jewish journalist that this is being double standard or anti-Semitic. On the other hand, a good medium from Israel can make all the difference in our overall position. And that brings me, of course, to the central questions that you've put. And to my mind, those central questions that you've put are questions that every editor and every media person has to have at the back of his mind. But there is absolutely no way that they can be resolved. They're not yes and no, and there are going to be continuous conflicts in these issues, and the issue is whether you have the kind of sensitivity and sobriety to make, at least in the majority of cases, the right decisions when the conflicts come up, because those conflicts are inevitable and you can't have a black and white situation. That's part of the Jewish life. As to questions you asked beforehand, I wish that Jewish journalism internationally was more a la Gary Rosenblatt than much of the other rubbish that we see. Because I must say that when I've seen criticisms of Israel, they're criticisms which are so deeply involved with a love and responsibility that I certainly would not put them in the category of mind your own business, you're not living in Israel. I would say the opposite. This is a criticism and address of love, or again, value judgments. And the very last point I want to make is, I think that what you have possibly not taken into account is the dramatic changes that we're going to see in the next couple of years. The Wall Street Journal has proven, although it is a business-orientated paper, that the internet will pay. The New York Times is going to move towards that in the next 6 or 12 months. My bet is that once that happens, the medias throughout the world, the media will move in that direction. And that may be the saving factor for the Israeli and other journalistic areas that are not parochial. Because we need to have international Jewish media. I'm sorry I've been talking more than asking, and I apologize.
Last one of this round, Bill. You get the mic.
Yeah,
Bill, take the mic.
Oh. I noticed in your survey of the history of Jewish journalism in America, anyway, you didn't mention the phenomenal success of a little newspaper based in Brooklyn called the Jewish Press, which has established a national following based on two things: the orthodoxy of its readership, and also the right-wing Zionist perspective of its readers. Now, is this a pattern that could be emulated? I mean, in basing success on zeroing in on one or two common interests that might, in fact, involve an entire national readership. I haven't seen that pattern emulated, but is this a possible direction for Jewish journalism?
Good. No, very wonderful comments. In the longer version, I spent time on the complicated question of defining Jewish journalism. For my purposes, I'm happy to see it self-defined. The Jewish Advocate, the Jewish Press, are clearly, from their name, self-defined as Jewish journalism. The New York Times may have a lot of Jewish news, but doesn't self-define as Jewish journalism. I think there is a membership organization, and obviously is the American Jewish Press Association. I assume its members self-define as Jewish journalists. In most matters of definition, in studies of the United States and also increasingly elsewhere, you base it on self-definition, obviously prescribed definition. Do you think that it's really a Jewish newspaper? May be altogether different, but I don't know who we would give authority to decide you're Jewish, you're not. So I think self-definition is best. The Israeli papers, I think, see themselves as Israeli, the Jewish as Jewish. It's a very old question. To what extent should editors tell countries what they should do? Of course, editors believe that they have that right. They tell Haiti, what you call here Haiti, what they should do, and I don't think that doesn't mean one needs to read the editorials, and people tend to like these kinds of things when they agree with the view of the editor, but no right to say that, he doesn't live there, when they don't agree with what he says, and I think we heard that here in terms of Gary Rosenblatt. The question of covering Israel is very interesting. In real life, that's an area that's been cut because it's very expensive, and even the Jewish Week greatly cut back, since I know the reporters, on its reporters here. That's too bad, because in some cases you had stringers or even reporters who were reporting on matters of direct interest to the American community. In other words, the folks from New York, or issues related to New York, or Boston, or Cincinnati, and so on. And that personal connection with Israel, I think, has somewhat been lost when we're getting all of the news from an Israeli perspective rather than from a certain journalist. Now, I completely agree with almost everything that Izzy Liebler said. I tell you what I wish we had in this country. If someone would have come to me and say, what should we do? I wouldn't have told him to do what Adelson did of getting a free newspaper and so on. What we do not have in Israel is the Columbia Journalism Review. In other words, an objective, well-respected body that investigates and writes investigative reports on journalists. And boy, if you've been investigated by the Columbia Journalism Review and they discover and reveal that you did shady practices, that you said X even though you knew Y, or that you cover up, you won't turn over information to them, you know, a lot of those journalists have lost their reputation forever. In other words, in this country, everybody agrees the journalists should be checking the government, but nobody has the idea that there's anybody that should check the journalists. I'm a great believer in checks and balances. And I think even though all my friends at NPR hate camera, you know the organization Camera? Boy, did Camera have an impact in America when it started going carefully through journalism. And I myself, having only been here a few months, but reading various papers, am deeply disappointed that we don't have something similar here, and I think it would do a lot for Israeli journalism. You know, the question of whether the Wall Street Journal system will pay or not is, of course, deeply debated. I've read it, and I'm sure you have. Some people argue businessmen are prepared to pay for the Wall Street Journal because by reading that news, they make money. But Amcha won't pay. And other people say they will pay. And the New York Times is experimenting, and it will be a very important experiment. I know many, many people who pray that you're right, because that will change everything. It will be a real game changer. Whether it turns out that you're right, you know, nidnan nevuah b'shotim, and I'm not going to be foolish enough to say anything. You're right, I didn't say anything about the Jewish press, but your question is a very important one. Your question is between two traditions of journalism. American journalism was deeply influenced by the dispassionate tradition of journalism, even though you and I know it's not really true if you know journalists. The ideal journalist in America, the New York Times held up that ideal, doesn't let you know what side he or she is on. And we respect journalists who are dispassionate, and you should have tremendous distinction between fact and opinion. That's the tradition. It is not the European tradition of journalism today. It's certainly not the Haaretz tradition, even though Haaretz sees itself as the New York Times. It couldn't be more different in terms of its approach. And it's frankly not the Jewish press tradition. The Jewish press has what we might call a passionate tradition of journalism. It has a point of view, and that comes across in the articles and in the great big headlines and so forth. It certainly has been successful. I don't know, the extent to which it has suffered. Recently, it tells people what they want to hear. Is that the role of the journalist, of the newspaper? Should we all be reading what we want to hear, or should we, be reading a wide variety of opinions? The New York Times, has always gone out of its way to have people on its editorial board who it knew you didn't want to hear. Yes, not everyone wanted to hear Bill Safire's point of view, and so on. The Forward, I think, has tried on occasion to do that. Noam Neusner was writing for a while. Most of the, I think the Forward, if the people who read the Jewish press don't like the Forward, and vice versa, and it's of course funded by Yiddishists, but the local Jewish papers have more come out of the dispassionate tradition. And you're right to point out that we have these two traditions, And one of the questions should be, which do we prefer? Let's go on.
Okay. Second round. First Sybil Kaplan, then Judge Bach.
Thank you.
This is very, very interesting because you've been talking about my bread and butter. I've been a stringer for North American Jewish papers for 40 years, here and in the States, so this is very interesting. But I wanted to ask you to comment on three things, if you would. One, a little bit about the AJPA, the American Jewish Press Association. Two, you didn't say anything about Jewish periodicals as part of Jewish journalism. Moment, Midstream, commentary. You just something about them. And the last question, you mentioned the Forward as a national Jewish newspaper. I write for another one, which you didn't mention because it's probably insignificant, but National Jewish Post and Opinion has been a very long-standing paper, and I wondered if there are any others that I haven't heard of. Can you comment on them?
Text van Judge Bach here. And thereafter Edward Cohen.
Actually, most of what I wanted to ask has already been covered, and I do not repeat it. So I want to thank you for your interesting analysis. There's just one point that I wasn't quite clear about. You mentioned that if people want to hear about the Israeli newspapers and the website, I can understand that. But what I'm not quite clear about, I mean, the ordinary Jewish local newspaper, you said the stress there is on local things, but to what extent is there in the local ordinary newspaper report about things in Israel, like let's say even tourism, let's say possibility of visiting places, even sports, let's say the Maccabiah, if do people are they interested? Do they hear about that? Developments inside Israeli parties that people know which have happened, and even if there are disputes or even accusations one against the other, does that interest people locally? And then, of course, are there sort of in the local ordinary Jewish newspapers, are there discussions and arguments about attacks against Israel, or now the latest problems, will they be fully discussed in the local newspapers, or is there really the real stress only on local matters?
Edward?
What if you could comment on how magazines which are not obviously Jewish, but Misha Mevin, like Commentary, TNR, The Atlantic, which when I read them I feel that they're very Jewish, but they're not officially Jewish. How does that fit in with your talk? And you didn't say anything about other media like radio, TV, etc. Maybe you want to comment on that if you have time. And can you say a word about Zeke?
And you can say something about it as well.
All right. Many of these were the same. The question was about the American Jewish Press Association. The sad thing is that in an earlier day, one of the benefits of being a Jewish journalist was that you came to the American Jewish Press Association conference, and that was really the professional conference of Jewish journalists. If you go now, you find it's mostly editors. They can't afford to send their journalists, and the journalists can't afford to go. And that has led to a lessened sense of professionalism within the field. The AJPA, of course, has just changed its staff completely. And you know, as there's less money for the central organization, which is really too bad. One would wish it were the prime advocate for the Jewish press. It's not been able to do that. It does give out awards. Those awards, I think, are some of the most important things it does, because there the Jewish press is saying these are the highest standards to which we aspire, the Jewish Pulitzers. And they tend to be rock hour the Rockhour prizes, and those I think are very important for setting forth standards. But obviously, one wishes that it were stronger. Many of you have asked, why about this or that or the other. I don't frankly think that the National Jewish Post and Opinion anymore has the kind of circulation that would really give it vast influence on the American Jewish scene. It's a remarkable phenomenon, more or less a one-man phenomenon for a very long time. It's hard to make a one-man phenomenon into something that's truly influential, and if you want to do it, you wouldn't do it his way. I don't know what the circulation is really today. I do agree that we have a lot of Jewish periodicals. Many of them are not really providing news in the traditional way. I think once upon a time, the Jewish newspaper, like the Occident, had both news and those kinds of features. And increasingly, we are separating them, even online. So JTA gives you day-to-day news, and Tablet gives you features. If you only read Tablet, it's hard to know what the news of the day is. If you only read JTA, you wouldn't have the benefit of the in-depth cultural coverage. And so it is here. Now, in terms of a very good question, I agree with you. Just as the New York Times, by many Jews, is seen as more objective, more reliable than the Jewish press, so the non-Jewish periodicals are more objective, more reliable. Jews are a huge and disproportionate percentage of all readers in the United States. That's true of books, that's true of magazines. And therefore, knowing that most people like to read about themselves, the press makes sure to have significant numbers of articles about them. But, one would need to go article by article. Commentary, which now has a blog, is not giving us news, it is giving us ideas, editorials, ways of thinking about the news. That's very different from traditional journalism. And I don't think that most of the Jewish newspapers, Jewish periodicals, even Moment, which once did more of it, are really doing journalism the way journalism once was really done. And as I still think we don't have much investigative journalism in Jewish life. Now, Zeke and Heeb are rather interesting because they reflect young people. And it's wonderful, really, that once again we see young people who created a lot of college student newspapers like Genesis 2 and many others in the 60s and 70s. And, later those folks became the new Jewish journalists, more hard-hitting, more willing to ask questions, more brash. So we see Heeb and Zeke, again, reflecting youth culture of today, willing to use language, and in the case of Heeb, deeply irreverent, but certainly reflecting a certain culture. Heeb's very name tells you much about it. In fact, when Heeb came out, the U.S. Post Office wanted to ban it from the mails, arguing that the term Heeb was defamatory, derogatory, and was not therefore in the public interest and shouldn't get a cheap mail. I was asked to send a letter on behalf of them, even though it's not quite my politics. I'm rather a believer in broad journalism. I wrote a magnificent letter to the judge on why they should do it and what Heeb was about and so on. And they promised me in return for that letter I would get a life subscription. And so I won't buy it for that reason, but I do see it online from time to time. Maybe that'll go on the web, and now they're sending it to me. But I do think it's a wonderful thing that young people express themselves, and there should be more such outlets. they too have had a great deal of difficulty financially, and there have been very interesting mergers, and more of it is online where the costs have gone down. You know, radio and TV is another subject altogether. There are now a couple of Jewish TV networks in the United States. I'm not the person that kind of really watch television. I don't think they've had vast influence, but perhaps that's only because I don't know what's there. But there are, among the plethora of stations, especially in New York, you can get, I think it's called Shalom TV, and that has Jewish. I did just want to say that business, which I think one of you alluded to, is about Israeli press and what is being read. I was deeply influenced by an article that's about to appear in Israel Studies by Ted Sassoon, who argues that it's not so much declension about Israel, the way Stephen M. Cohen has argued, that actually young people are they're almost obsessed with Israel, but today the diaspora conflicts mirror homeland conflicts. And the critics of Israel are simply reading, Amira Hess and the folks here. Whereas for many years, before the internet, America was united behind the government of Israel. That was the whole aim of the Conference of Presidents and the JCPA and so on. The argument was, as one of you made here, Israel, it's their country and their lives. They can have robust debate. Our job is to support the government. Those days are over. Today, people read, their point of view, and what's interesting, if we're looking at Inyana Diyoma, is it seems to me that J Street has actually gone beyond, say, Haaretz in the current conflict. J Street put out a statement urging the American government to be even tougher on Israel. It was not the line Haaretz took. And that's interesting. I think in a lot of ways it's for a different day, how that'll settle down. But for a while, although there was much criticism of J Street, the head argued, listen, everything we say you can find in the Israeli press. And that was correct, and I think strengthens Mr. Lieber's point about the impact of reporting from Israel. And what the fact that it was reported in an Israeli paper, of course, made it legitimate in particular ways. And as you've heard, my own sense is it would be a good thing if there was more, if there was an estate that followed and covered and kept honest the newspapers. I think that's important too. Nobody should think they are the